When is a crisis not a crisis at all, but a permanent state of affairs? What we call Canada's housing crisis has been written about, debated, and governed for decades. In fact, the author of a new book argues it isn't really a crisis at all, but the system working exactly as intended. As he puts it, there is no housing crisis, just good old landlords squeezing high rents from tenants. Here to talk about the tenant class is Ottawa-based author, political economist, and senior researcher with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, Ricardo Tranjan. Welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Now, Ricardo, one of the accepted notions you challenge right off the bat is the relationship between supply and demand and the housing market. For instance, why can't we simply build more housing to drive down the cost of rent?
Yes, more housing is absolutely necessary, but additional supply is not sufficient. So it's important to make this distinction. I by no ways want to advocate that we don't need to build houses. We do need to build house. We always need to build housing because our population is growing, our needs are changing, and so we need to accommodate that. But it's not just any housing anywhere at any cost. We need to have more deliberated policies that shape the kind of housings we build, where we build them, and we also need to have controls in place to regulate how much they're going to go for. For example, truly affordable house for the lowest income segment of the population is very unlikely to be met through private development. We will have to be non-profit marketing, because once you put the profit margin in there, it just can be affordable. So this is the kind of discussions we have to have. Pretending that supply will solve all the problems doesn't help.
And it sounds like many folks have a vested interest in the status quo, not just landlords, as you point out, but everyone from developers to academics. And you make an interesting distinction here, and I want to touch on it as well. What is the difference then between problem-solving research and critical research in this area?
Basically, the critical research will take a step back and look at the narratives that we have and be a little bit more critical about it and say, well, is this narrative, is this solution that we're proposing over and over and over, is that perhaps furthering the interests of a particular group as opposed to other groups? And that's a very actually traditional way of looking at economics, right? Classic economics was called political economy because the folks back then were unwilling to separate the economics from the politics, because they understood they came together. And like perhaps nowhere there is more true than when it touched land, right? So you're talking about Britain back then and the landed aristocracy deciding who's going to get taxed and who's not going to get taxed. That is the fundamental political issues that is behind housing. It's just later on, when we get used to new classic economics and we talk about supply and demand, we kind of put aside all that like messy political stuff. And that can be helpful in some ways for some academic work. But in the day-to-day, we need to bring the politics back and say, well, this argument that supply will solve the problem, maybe it's, catering for some interests, but definitely not for others. And let's just have that real conversation about it.
Another thing that's very interesting as well is you talk about the four persistent myths about renters that are harmful to their cause, that renting is a phase, that tenants don't pay property taxes, that a large share of tenants don't work, and that everyone would do anything to own a home. Why do you think these myths are allowed to persist?
Yes, it is part of our culture in Canada and of other Anglo-Saxon countries. We have equated home ownership with success, with security, with making it, right? That's how you made it to the middle class. You're a homeowner now. And there's a whole set of status that is attached to it. And that is detrimental to have a broader conversation about what do we need when it comes to housing, right? I feel that sometimes folks really are looking or are talking about housing security, not or not home ownership, right? What's the distinction, right? So I have 2 young children. I want to move to a neighborhood. I want to build community. I want to build, a safety kind of net around me. I want to make sure that I won't get asked to move to another neighborhood in the middle of the school year. I actually love my kids to go to the same school until grade 11. I wanted to invest in this kind of labor market and adapt my skills so I can have good jobs in this. All of this makes folks seek for housing security. But is ownership the only way of achieving that housing security? Is it actually a way to achieving housing security if you're indebted at that really high level that some homeowners are indebted right now, right? So I think the fixation on home ownership, all the sort of negative views attached and the stigma attached to renting kind of prevents us from having a better conversation about the different options to achieve housing security, which I believe to be the ultimate thing that a lot of people are looking forward to, and in some countries that is more commonly achieved through renting. If renting is regulated, if it's renting is of good quality, if there's no stigma attached to it, right?
Our conversation with Ricardo Tranjan continues in part 2.